Excessive hair growth, deformed limbs, and conjoined twins are just a few examples that comprise the arguably distinct American phenomenon that was the circus freak show. Hey y'all, I'm Christina, this is Stella, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Now, just a quick reminder that I'm not a historian or any type of expert, but as always, my sources are linked down below. Today's episode is one that I've been wanting to do for a while, and it also has been requested quite a few times, so I hope that you enjoy it. Before we get into it, I would like to stop and thank today's sponsor, Factor. I know you guys all know what I mean when I say that life is busy between work, keeping up with all the kids' activities, maintaining friendships, not to mention keeping up with everything around the house. Trying to eat well is just one more thing to add to the already overflowing to-do list. That's where Factor comes in. Factor gives you the flexibility to continue your active lifestyle without succumbing to a quick cheat meal. Their meals are fresh, never frozen. Just 2 minutes in the microwave is all you need to get fueled up for the next part of your day. Factor recently just doubled the size of their menu with more than 80 rotating meals every single week, and it's their healthiest menu yet. They've added 2 times more protein-packed options like beef fillets and turkey, plus way more seafood like salmon and shrimp, you name it. My family's personal favorite meals are the steak and shrimp options, and since my husband and I have been focusing on getting more protein over this past year, Factor has been a perfect solution for those busy nights when we're on the go. They've also added a customization option where you can swap out proteins for free. So if you love chicken but hate pork chops, you can switch it out and still enjoy the meal that you want. I honestly love that I don't have to think about it. Factor takes the guesswork out of eating smart, and with all of the exciting new flavors being added to the menu, you can enjoy nutritious meals without compromising on flavor. So if you're like me and you could use a little extra help sticking to your routines, you should check out Factor. And right now, Factor has a special deal for my viewers. So head to factor75.com or click the link down below and use code HISTORYFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for a year. That's code HISTORYFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for a year. The term freak appears to be descended from the Old English freaking, which meant to dance, or freakin'. This signified a sudden movement or capricious behavior. During the 18th century, as scientists made efforts to find specific categories for all life forms and started creating biological classifications, organisms that failed to match a perceived species average were often referred to as Lusus, Naturae, cohorts, or freaks of nature. In the early 19th century, some naturalists began touring Europe and North America, showing off examples of exotic or unique animals. They charged admission for people to see their cabinets of curiosities, and humans who had bodies that deviated significantly from what was an understood norm were also grouped into these Lusus Naturae shows as well. This eventually led to a variety of different genres that would collectively become known as the freak shows. These early freak shows were non-theatrical exhibits that really just displayed their oddities. Everything from fetuses in jars, exotic or deformed animals, and even humans, like I mentioned. And in this context, the term freak was considered to have negative connotations, as it was seen as belittling the person to whom it was referring, much in the same way that we would see it today. So the term freak was rarely used by professional performers or promoters, and shows during that time in the early 19th century that we would now consider today to be freak shows were called rarity shows, pit shows, or kid shows at the time. So while the first traveling sideshow that displayed individuals who could be classified as freak show performers or human curiosities is documented to have been in 1738, these were not highly professionalized and appeared more often in scientific literatures or theatrical performances. And the term freak show did not come into use until close to the end of the 19th century after the death of the American showman P.T. Barnum. Barnum himself is not believed to have ever used this term. During the middle part of the 19th century is when many of these individuals gained great recognition, respectability, and even profitability by performing their acts within the context of a new form of American entertainment known as dime museums. However, many of these performers did not achieve success and were often exploited by promoters and audiences. Okay, so we've established that the first traveling sideshow was in 1738. Now, this one displayed a woman who was taken from West Africa and was exhibited for her appearance. An advertisement in Virginia described her as 4 foot tall and having the body of a woman but the face of an ape. The first circus was performed in Philadelphia in 1793 by equestrian performer John Bill Ricketts. He toured, showcasing riding acts, clown performances, and tightrope walking. In the 1820s, traveling animal shows and exhibitions were standalone attractions that were separate from the circus. In 1825, the Big Top was born when John Purdy Brown replaced the wooden structures that housed the circus with a big canvas tent, which led to the merging of the traveling animal show with the circus in the 1830s, bringing more traditional acts and performances all under the same roof. The 1830s is also when Isaac Van Amberg brought in a new type of entertainment, becoming the world's first famous lion tamer. Isaac is credited with being the first to perform the trick of sticking his head into a lion's mouth, which of course would eventually be integrated into the circus. By the 19th century, many circuses began to offer sideshows in addition to their more mainstream featured performances. These shows were often advertised as dime museums, which I mentioned earlier, and this is where visitors would pay one fee and get to see a variety of displays such as these so-called human curiosities, auditoriums, human wonders, or freak shows. The performers of these shows were often marginalized by society and had very few choices to make a living outside of the circus. James Anthony McGinnis was born on July 4th, 1847, and as a teenager he worked for F.H. Bailey in his traveling circus. Now, F.H. Bailey was the nephew of Hecaliah Bailey, who was the founder of one of America's earliest circuses. He had purchased an Indian elephant in 1808, which he named Old Bet. Now, this was one of the very first elephants to have come to America, so as you can imagine, people wanted to see it, and it was the main attraction of the Bailey Circus. Now, while Hecaliah Bailey was a role model for young P.T. Barnum, who wrote about meeting him, he was not the Bailey he would later partner with. That was James McInnes, who changed his name to James Bailey after working with Hecaliah's nephew, F.H. Bailey. So, modeling the previous Bailey before him, James McInnes, now James Bailey, acquired an African alien. What in the world? Acquired an African elephant from his brother's travels and showed the beautiful creature off to spectators for a small fee. Now, while others were doing similar things, the way that James Bailey was doing it seemed grander somehow and kind of started to snowball into more and more people copying this business model of putting animals on display for the price of admission, which eventually led to these shows traveling around the country. P.T. Barnum was another American showman that we mentioned earlier who popularized amusements such as the Public Museum, the musical concert, and the three-ringed circus. In 1834, he moved to New York City, and just 1 year later, he found his vocation as a showman when he successfully presented an elderly woman as being the 161-year-old nurse of General George Washington. Now, on her deathbed, it was revealed that this had all been a hoax and that the woman was only in her 80s, but this was the beginning of what would lead him to his career as a showman. In 1840, he developed the American Museum in New York City, where visitors could pay a dime to see various displays. Of course, these are the dime museums that we talked about earlier. There were a lot of fake historical items that Barnum basically made up out of his own imagination and put in there, but there were also the individuals with physical differences that were on display. These could be people with dwarfism, albinism. It could be someone who is just massively overweight, or any various number of physical differences where people would just come and gawk at them, basically. After having two fires in 1865 and 1868, Barnum decided to take his show on the road. Around 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad arrived and made traveling across the country much more obtainable, and traveling entertainment became all the rage. Of course, we know that P.T. Barnum's path would later lead to that partnership we talked about earlier with James A. Bailey, and their so-called greatest show on earth is what made the American circus the popular and gigantic spectacle that we think of it as today. But Prior to all of that success, which his and Bailey's names are both famous for today, Barnum's move into the human oddities, or so-called freak show space, would prove to be his most profitable exhibit thus far. General Tom Thumb was the first major attraction promoted by P.T. Barnum. Born in 1838 as Charles Stratton to parents of normal stature, Charles stopped growing at 6 months of age when he was only 25 inches tall and weighed only 15 pounds. Now, when he was a teenager, he started to grow again and eventually grew to a height of 40 inches or 3.3 feet tall and weighed in at 70 pounds. When he was just 4 years old, Charles was hired by Barnum for his museum and was advertised as an 11-year-old dwarf from England, whom he called General Tom Thumb. Now, dwarfism is a medical condition that you guys are probably familiar with, and it consists of being unusually short in stature or small size. Now, back in this day, the term dwarf was used to describe individuals with disproportions of body and limb, while the term midget referred to those who had reduced stature but normal proportions, like someone with proportional dwarfism. Today, neither of these words typically would be used in casual conversation, and little people has become the preferred term for many with these conditions. Now, while I'll be referring to the medical condition of dwarfism in this episode, I thought it was interesting to note that the reason the term midget is now considered offensive is because it's believed to have been popularized through entertainers like P.T. Barnum. So because of this, the term is now associated with the public display of people for curiosity and amusement, which is why it now carries such a negative and potentially offensive connotation. Going by Tom Thumb, Charles quickly became a widely known and celebrated figure. So in 1863, when he married fellow circus performer Lavinia Warren, the wedding celebration was one of the biggest events of the 19th century. Born Mercy Lavinia Warren Bump, Lavinia had a form of proportionate dwarfism and was just 2 foot 8 inches tall. Lavinia had always enjoyed dancing and performing, and after having had a successful career as a well-respected school teacher, she decided to start dancing on her cousin's Mississippi showboat when she learned about Charles Stratton, aka Tom Thumb's, success and decided to pursue a performing career for herself. Eventually, she was under the management of Barnum and changed her name to Lavinia Warren, which had been her previous stage name when she was performing on that Mississippi riverboat. Eventually, she became known as the Little Queen of Beauty. She was working at Barnum's American Museum when she met and fell in love with Charles, aka Tom Thumb. Now, after the very elaborate wedding that took place on February 10th of 1863, Barnum sold tickets to the reception for $75 each to the first 5,000 people who applied. Once married, the couple's fame grew even larger. President Abraham Lincoln and his wife even provided a reception for the new couple at the White House, and Tiffany & Co. gave them a silver coach. While the couple pretended to have a child for the public, the two of them did not actually have any children, which honestly was probably for the best because Lavinia's sister, who had the same type of proportional dwarfism as she did, had actually gotten pregnant with a normal-sized baby. And of course, she was so excited about this, but unfortunately, both her and her 6-pound baby had passed away during the birth. Tom and Lavinia earned and spent a fortune over the course of their lives together. Adjusting the amount they made for inflation meant that they were millionaires. And while their fame afforded them this life of luxury, it also came with many downsides. They were presented as very childlike to the public by Barnum, who used this as a sort of advertising strategy to make the audience feel sympathetic towards the couple. And while they were some of the most famous people in America at the time, because of the way they were presented, people treated them like children. When people met Lavinia, they often wanted to pet her and hold her. And she said in her autobiography, "It seemed impossible to make people understand at first that I was not a child, that being a woman, I had the womanly instinct of shrinking from a form of familiarity, which in the case of a child my size would have been as natural as it was permissible." Even though she was not extremely fond of how she was viewed in the public, Lavinia continued to perform since her life revolved around her presence in the media. She once said, "I belong to the public." On July 15th, 1883, Tom died suddenly of a stroke. He was just 45 years old. It's said that after he passed away, Lavinia wanted to retire to a private life, but was persuaded to continue on with her performance career. 2 years after being widowed, Lavinia met and married Italian Count Primo Maggi, who also had dwarfism. The two owned and operated a famous roadside stand and appeared in a silent film together in 1915 when Lavinia was 73. Lavinia died on November 25th, 1919 at the age of 78. She was buried next to her first husband, Charles, or Tom Thumb, with a simple gravestone that reads, his wife. Millie and Christine McCoy, who were known as the Carolina Twins, were born into slavery on the plantation of Jabez McCoy in North Carolina on July 11, 1851. The twins were conjoined at the lower spine and stood at an approximately 90-degree angle to each other. When they were just 10 months old, their parents and slavers sold them into the entertainment business, which is just so incredibly sad. The twins were sold several times before their first successful promoter purchased them in Boston when they were 4 years old. And through what is said to have been a convoluted series of business deals and cons, the twins were exhibited at various fairs and freak shows around America and Canada before finally ending up in Britain. In 1857, the sisters were said to have been rescued by an American businessman backer named Smith, who had traveled to Britain with their mother to save them. Smith held their ownership through a promissory note, and he and his wife provided the twins with an education. They were taught to speak 5 languages, dance, play music, and sing. Because of the way that Millie and Christine's bodies were conjoined, they weren't able to walk normally and would fall over. This caused the twins to develop a sideways walk that turned into a crowd-pleasing dance once they were on stage. Millie and Christine had amazing singing voices and harmonized well together. They were known as the Two-Headed Nightingale or Carolina Nightingale, and went on to have very successful careers singing and dancing around the world. The twins' mottos was, "As God decreed, we agreed." Physicians took great interest in studying how the girls were joined, and after studying them extensively, it was determined that they shared portions of their pelvis and spinal cord, which would make separation impossible. The twins were intelligent, and though they had 2 totally separate personalities, they often referred to themselves in the singular. While Smith was the twins' last legal owner, they were abducted from his care twice by men who sought to exploit them. Smith went on tour with the girls all over the United States, Canada, and Europe before the start of the Civil War, and during the war, he hid them away in South Carolina to prevent them from being kidnapped again. On January 1st, 1863, with the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation, Millie and Christine were legally free women, and when the American Civil War ended, they became celebrities, traveling and performing in practically every state, appearing with the Barnum Circus, and even got to meet Queen Victoria of England 3 separate times. She wrote in her journal about how much she enjoyed their performances and even presented them with gifts of jewelry. Now, some sources say that the twins' father had managed to purchase the plantation that they had been born on and left it to them, while others say that the twins purchased the plantation for themselves. But either way, the twins, who are now in their 30s, had acquired not only fame, but a good deal of money as well. And they were able to move onto that plantation as the owners, which I can only imagine must have meant a great deal to them. They built a 10-bedroom house on the property where they lived between their tours. Finally, in 1900, the tours had started to slow down and the two retired to their home, which unfortunately burned down in 1909. Millie suffered from tuberculosis and passed away on October 8, 1912 at the age of 61. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there was no way to safely separate Christine from her sister, and so she was heavily sedated by doctors and passed away the next day. Millie and Christine had been worried that they might be dissected post-mortem, and so they made it known that they wanted to be cremated in order to avoid this. However, they were placed in a specially made coffin and buried near their home, but the gravesite was then guarded for almost a full year afterward in order to prevent any grave robbers from digging them up. Their headstone reads, "A soul with 2 thoughts, 2 hearts that beat as one." Over the years that followed, the cemetery became overgrown, and eventually in 1969, the Columbus County Historical Society moved their remains to Welch's Creek Community Cemetery. Several books were written about the twins' experiences, which I have not got a chance to read yet, but I've added them to my list because I am so interested to learn more about them. And if you're also interested, I'll link those down below the episode. Annie Jones is considered by many to be the most well-known bearded lady, from the circus at least. Annie was born in 1865 with hirsutism, which is a condition that causes excessive hair growth in females in a male pattern of distribution. So basically, she had hair in places that normally only men have hair, like on the face. Now, we don't know 100% that this is the condition Annie had, since the medical community wasn't diagnosing this until closer to like 1905, but it's believed to be very likely what she had. And of course, nowadays we know that this condition is caused by an imbalance in hormones, especially an increase in male hormones. But for Annie's parents, when they saw that precious baby come straight out of her mother's womb with hair on her chin, they saw dollar signs. Apparently, bearded ladies were a big attraction at these circus freak shows, and when Annie was just 9 months old, her parents decided to put her in the circus as the infant Esau, which was, of course, a reference to the famously hairy brother of Jacob in the Bible. And apparently this worked, because before she was even able to walk, Annie was a hit. She was such a big hit, in fact, that Barnum offered her mother a 3-year contract for $150. But Annie's career as a sideshow attraction would last much, much longer than those 3 years. She went from being the infant Esau to Esau lady to eventually being the bearded lady. Now, of course, Annie didn't have any choice in being a circus freak, as her parents had chosen this life for her, but she did decide to make the most of the hand that she had been dealt. She felt that her appearance might be frightening to some, and so she appealed to audiences by trying to play up her femininity in contrast with her facial hair. She dressed in very fashionable feminine clothing, and because she didn't enjoy just being stared at, she also learned to play the mandolin. People went nuts for it, and Annie became one of the most memorable acts from this era, out-earned many of her counterparts from a very young age. In 1880, when she was only 15 years old, Annie married Richard Elliott. Richard was employed as a sideshow barker, which of course is the guys who shout at passersby and try to get them to come in and see this show. And Richard was a full-grown man who had just married a 15-year-old. As you can imagine, Annie's parents disapproved of this marriage, and it said that Richard worked to conceal just how young Annie was. Now, despite the age difference, their marriage lasted 15 years before the two got divorced, and Annie eventually remarried a man named William Donovan. Annie then went on the road with her new husband as a duo act, and they toured Europe together before he suddenly passed away just 4 years later. At this point, instead of continuing to travel, Annie decided to join P.T. Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth. While at Barnum's show, Annie built quite a bit of fame and fortune for herself as a freak. But at this point in her career, she began campaigning against using the word freak to describe sideshow performers. As someone who had spent her life in the circus, she wanted to be an advocate for the protection and integrity of circus performers. Unfortunately, she passed away at just 37 years old from tuberculosis, having not been able to see the term freak laid to rest. For more than a century, a particular physical condition had affected the Styles family. The rare congenital deformity called ectrodactyly meant that their hands looked like lobster claws, as the middle fingers were either missing or fused to the thumb or pinky. While many people viewed this condition as a handicap, the Styles family saw it as an opportunity. This was such a common trait in this family going all the way back to the 1800s that they developed their own circus act, calling themselves the Lobster Family. And this show became a carnival staple throughout the early 20th century. Unfortunately for this family, when Grady Stiles Jr. came along, he would bring attention to his family in a way that none of them would have ever imagined or wanted. Grady was born in 1937, and since his father was already part of the freak show circuit, when his children were born, if they had the same condition as him, he would add them into his act. When Grady came along, he had a pretty severe version of the condition that affected both his hands and his feet, which meant that he couldn't walk. Grady was added to the circus act as Lobster Boy. For most of his life, Grady got around in a wheelchair, but he also used his upper body to pull himself around at times, which meant that he built up quite a bit of strength in his upper body. Throughout his childhood, the Styles family traveled around with the carnival and made a really good living, making anywhere from $50,000 to $80,000 per season simply by letting people come and stare at them. Grady met another carnival worker named Maria. Now, she was not a part of the act. She was simply a staff member, but when Mary and Grady met, they fell in love and got married. Grady and Maria went on to have 2 children. Now, he had a daughter, Kathy, who didn't have the condition, and his daughter, Donna, who did. Now, Donna was added to the Circus Act, just like all the other family members with this condition before her, but Kathy was said to be the apple of her father's eye. Unfortunately, this is around the time that things started to take a turn for the worse. Grady drank, and when he did, it was said that he began using his overpowering upper body strength against his wife as he started abusing her. Now, I was shocked to learn that IUDs existed way back in those days, but allegedly, Grady ripped his wife's from her body during one of their fights, which oh my gosh, it hurts just to even say that. I mean, we're going to move on from that. But he was also known to use his powerful hands to choke her. But things only got worse from there when his daughter Donna was a teenager and she started dating a guy that Grady didn't approve of. Donna decided to get married to this young man anyway, and Grady decided that he would take matters into his own hands to end this relationship. So he took a shotgun and ended his daughter's fiance's life in cold blood. Grady admitted to the crime without any remorse and was put on trial. He pointed out that no jail could handle his disability and that to confine him would be cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, I felt like he kind of earned that one for himself. By this time, Grady also had liver cirrhosis from his years of drinking and also emphysema from his years of cigarette smoking. And so the court kind of just agreed with him that, yeah, the prison wasn't equipped for dealing with his various issues and disabilities. And so they just sent him home with 15 years probation. Now, by this time, he had divorced his first wife and then went on to remarry another woman who he also had 2 additional children with. His new family was unfortunately also subjected to his drunken rampages, and eventually his second wife divorced him. Now, what happened next seemed to shock everyone when in 1989, his first wife agreed to remarry him. Like, girl, what? You got away. Now, of course, at this point, after having murdered someone in cold blood, admitting to it, and then just walking away without any prison time, Grady seemed to feel like he was above the law, probably because he kind of was. And so this is when things really started to get worse, and the beatings of his first and now third wife, same lady, got so much more severe than they had been the first time around. By this point, their children were grown and gone, but just a few years into the remarriage, Maria paid a 17-year-old neighbor boy, Chris, $1,500 to take her husband out for her. Apparently, her son, Glenn, from another marriage, helped her to come up with this idea and carry out the plan. So, one night, Chris walked over and shot Grady at point-blank range. And when they went to the trial, none of them denied it. Maria simply said that she felt her husband was going to kill her family. The jury convicted the neighbor boy of second-degree murder, and he was given 27 years in prison. Maria and her son Glenn were both convicted of first-degree murder. Now, Maria got 12 years in prison, and she tried to convince her son Glenn to take a plea deal, but he refused, and so he got life in prison. Maria appealed her conviction, but was unsuccessful. And while his family was on trial for his murder, the funeral home went forward with burying Grady Styles. But he was so disliked in the community that they couldn't find anyone who was willing to be a pallbearer for him. It's an unfortunate fact of the past that people with physical deformities were viewed as subhuman by the general public, which meant that they were often admitted to institutions and locked away. For some who faced this reality, the ability to work in the circus as a sideshow performer was a dream come true. And it gave them not only the financial resources they needed to live, but also a sense of purpose and belonging. Traveling around the world with other performers built camaraderie, especially since many of them faced similar struggles due to their physical differences or disabilities. Many of the performers were compensated generously for their appearance in the sideshows. Some even became incredibly wealthy, like we mentioned with Tom Thumb and his wife. Jojo the dog-faced boy, whose real name was Fedor Jeftachu, was displayed for the overgrowth of thick hair that grew on his face. He was one of the highest paid performers, making around $500 weekly, which would be around $13,000 in today's money. His retirement savings amounted to almost $300,000 or $7.6 million in today's money. Of course, what he was subjected to earn that money. He was constantly compared to a dog and sometimes made to pretend that he was mad and told to growl at the audience. I mean, that's a lot of money, but you do have to wonder what being treated like that has to do to a person's mental health. Of course, there were some pretty serious moral dilemmas all throughout the time that these shows were running. Some of the biggest were the fact that some of these people weren't choosing to be there of their own free will. And of course, many of the performers' backstories and conditions were embellished by managers to make them seem more like outcasts, which drew larger crowds. Some were kidnapped and forced to perform, while others were tricked into signing something that would turn them into indentured servants, possibly for a certain period of time, but then they were just never given their freedom. Like Sarah Baartman, who was an African woman who was enslaved and taken to Europe, where her body was put on display for paying audiences. Now, fair warning, her story's just gonna make you angry, but Sarah had a condition called steatopygia, which meant that she developed an unusually large backside. An English doctor visited her country in 1810, and when he and his brothers saw her, they decided that they could make some money off of her. And so, even though she could not read English, the doctor had her sign a contract that he had written up that required her to travel to England and Ireland as an indentured servant. However, the terms of the contract were false, and Sarah remained enslaved for the rest of her life. Now, once she was taken to England, the doctor set up exhibits to show off Sarah's body. She was made to appear in front of crowds wearing very little clothing, and members of the public came just to look at her. This turned out to be a very profitable venture for the doctor and his brother, but Sarah received very little of that money. Now, some English people who saw what was going on were very sympathetic because they knew that this was definitely not right, and so they filed a lawsuit to try to stop these exhibits. However, the doctor showed authorities the contract that Sarah had signed and also had Sarah testify that she was not being mistreated, and so these exhibits were allowed to continue. Sarah was later sold to another abuser who allowed customers to essay her. She was also subjected to examinations by scientists, and Sarah would go on to die at only 26 years of age. However, even her death could not stop them from abusing her. For many years, her remains were displayed in a museum in Paris to support unfounded theories about the genetics of those with African ancestry. In 1994, Nelson Mandela asked France to return Sarah Baartman's remains to South Africa, and in 2002, France finally agreed, and Sarah's remains were returned and buried near her birthplace in Eastern Cape Province. There are unfortunately many other horrific examples of people who were treated extremely inhumane, just like Sarah. Some of the performers were even kept in cages next to the animals as a way to further dehumanize them to the audience. Now, while time prevents me from getting into the many more stories that we could talk about today, while I was editing this episode, I came across one story that I found so hard to believe that I just had to talk about it. Julia Pastrana was born in 1834 in the mountains of western Mexico with two rare genetic conditions: hirsutism, which is the excessive hair growth condition we talked about earlier, and gingival hyperplasia, which is thickening lips and gums, which of course those two things together gave her an unusual appearance. Because of the superstitions involving werewolves and other such creatures that were prevalent among the tribes in the area at that time, when Julia was born covered in hair and having an unusual look to her face, her mother fled with her into the mountains. 2 years later, some local Mexican herders were searching for a missing cow when they came across Julia and her mother hiding in a cave. They brought the two back to the nearest city, and Julia was placed in an orphanage. She was a sweet, intelligent girl, and her entire body was covered in black hair. Her unusual looks and charming personality quickly made her a local celebrity. When the state governor heard about her, he adopted her as a live-in amusement and to be his maid. Julia lived with the governor until she was 20 years old, then attempted to return home to her own tribe. Unfortunately, she never made it, as the American showman M. Rates met her along the journey and persuaded her to take up a life on the stage. Julia would go on to be extremely famous, going by names such as the Ape Woman, the Bear Woman, and the Baboon Lady. While her act included singing and dancing, it's said that the crowds came more for her appearance than anything else. Julia was also advertised as the Bear Woman from the wilds of Mexico. One newspaper reported about her: "The eyes of this Lusus Naturae beam with intelligence, while its jaws, jagged fangs, and eyes are terrifically hideous. Nearly its whole frame is coated with long glossy hair. Its voice is harmonious, for this semi-human being is perfectly docile and speaks the Spanish language." Physician Alexander B. Mott examined Julia during a private backroom interview and declared that she was a hybrid, half human and half orangutan. All of the promotion around Julia was focused on her femininity, but also consistently highlighted her animalisticness. And although scientists debated whether she was part animal, many realized she was fully human, an intelligent, gentle woman who was being exploited for profit. Julia's promoter, who eventually ended up marrying her, Theodore Lent, controlled her life and career, keeping her veiled in public to preserve her mystery. Julia did express love for him, but her existence seemed to be deeply lonely. In 1860, while touring Moscow, Julia gave birth to a son who inherited her condition. Both he and Julia died just days later due to childbirth complications. Lent brought their bodies to a professor who embalmed them using a new technique. Once the procedure was completed, Lent reclaimed their bodies and exhibited the preserved bodies throughout Europe, displaying them as attractions. This guy basically took his wife and his son and taxidermied their bodies. As terrible as everything that happened to Julia was throughout her life, that was the part that I just could not believe. Julia and her baby's mummified remains continued to circulate across Europe for over a century, being displayed in circuses, fairs, and anatomical exhibits. By the 20th century, changing attitudes condemned such displays, and her body ended up forgotten in a Norwegian medical collection. In the 2000s, artist Laura Anderson Barbada campaigned for the return of Julia's remains. After years of effort, Norway finally agreed, and in 2013, Julia Pastrana was returned to Mexico and buried near her birthplace with full honors over 150 years after her death. Okay, now that I've made all of you guys super angry with that story, let's wind things down with a story that is also very tragic, but has a little ray of sunshine in the end. Joseph Merrick was born August 5th, 1862. Now, he is the Englishman who I spoke about in my previous episode, which is when I got the request to do this topic. So in that episode, I only gave like a really brief overview. So today I felt that I needed to go a bit further into his story. Now, I learned about him as a kid when we read a book about him, which I don't unfortunately remember the name of the book, but we also watched a movie about him that I haven't seen since I was a kid, but it really stuck with me. So I'm going to link that down below the episode if you guys want to go and check that out. Now, in that movie, as well as in various other places, they sometimes call him John instead of Joseph because someone apparently said his name wrong somewhere at some point, and so it kind of got reported incorrectly, but his name was Joseph. So, Joseph Merrick was born in 1862. And he was completely normal until the age of 5 when he began to show signs of a rare condition that caused large tumors to grow all over his body. The size of his head began to increase until it reached 3 feet in circumference, with spongy skin hanging from the back of his head and across his face. His jaw was deformed to the point that it prohibited him from making normal facial expressions or speaking clearly. His left arm was normal, but his wrist on his right side was 12 inches in circumference, and he had a fin-like hand. His legs were deformed in the same manner, and he had a defective hip from a childhood injury so that he could only walk with the help of a cane. When he was just 11 years old, his mother, whom he was very close to, passed away. Joseph would later say that her death was the greatest misfortune of his life. It was around this time that he quit school. It's said that the teasing he received for his appearance was now too much to bear, as he no longer had his mother to go home to. Around 18 months later, his father remarried, and his stepmother was cruel. He later wrote, "She was the means of making my life a perfect misery." His father also withdrew affection around this same time, and the boy felt very alone. He ran away a few times, but was taken back to his father each and every time. His stepmother demanded that if he was not going to go to school, then he had to be making money. So when he was just 13 years old, he found work rolling cigars at a factory. But after 3 years of this, his right hand had worsened to the point that he no longer had the dexterity that was needed to continue on with his job. He began wandering the streets looking for a job and avoiding going home, where he would have to listen to his stepmother's taunts. If he returned home for lunch, she would give him half of a meal and say that that was more than he had earned. As he grew older, Joseph was seen as a greater and greater financial burden on his family, so his father eventually secured him a hawker's license so that he could be a door-to-door salesman. However, this was not successful because Joseph's facial deformities inhibited him from speaking clearly, and of course, people were also surprised by his appearance and would refuse to open the door to him. One day in 1877, Joseph was so severely beaten by his father that he decided to leave for good. Joseph's uncle heard that he was homeless and offered to have him come and stay with him. Now, he was around 15 years old at this time, and he continued to try to hawk around London to make money. Unfortunately, his disfigurement drew such negative attention from the public that his hawker's license was withdrawn. And his uncle, who had young children to provide for, could no longer afford to provide for his nephew. And this is when Joseph, who was 17 years old at this point, entered a workhouse. Now, around 1882, he underwent a surgery on his face for a protrusion that was in his mouth and had grown to be about 8 or 9 inches and was severely inhibiting his speech and also making it difficult for him to eat. So this operation was performed in the workhouse infirmary by Dr. Clement Frederick Brown, and they were able to remove a large part of the mass. Joseph was always on the lookout for a better way to make a living, and so when he first arrived at the workhouse, he had gotten permission to work on the outside, but ran into all of the same issues as before. So finally, after 4 years of being at the workhouse, he came up with a plan to try and make a living by working in a sideshow. So in 1884, Joseph joined a freak show where he was nicknamed the Elephant Man and advertised as half a man and half an elephant. And people were fascinated by him. There were all these wild stories about why he looked the way he did. Now, Joseph's mother told a story about how when she was pregnant with him, she had gone to see his show and she was in a crowd of people and she had been jostled and pushed around, which had caused her to fall down, and an elephant had stepped right near her head. Now, this is how the family always explained Joseph's symptoms to him, as being a result of his mother's fall and her having been so frightened by that fairground elephant. And so this came from the belief back then of maternal impression, which was that the emotional experiences of a pregnant woman could have a lasting physical effect on their unborn child. Now, this was still a common belief in 19th century Britain, and so Joseph believed all throughout his life that this is what had caused his disability. After touring with a sideshow for a while, Joseph traveled to London to be exhibited in a shop. Now, this shop owner would gather an audience by standing outside the shop and calling out to passersby. He explained that the Elephant Man was not here to frighten you, but to enlighten you. The man would then pull back the curtain and allow people to view the Elephant Man close up. It's said that the Elephant Man's exhibit was moderately successful, with most of the money being made from the sales of an autobiographical pamphlet that was sold in the shop. Now, during this time, Joseph put his share of the profits into savings in the hopes that he could one day earn enough money to buy his own home. But for the time being, he was allowed to sleep in an iron bed at the back of the shop. He had to sleep sitting up because he was afraid that the weight of his enormous head would crush his neck. Now, this shop that he was being displayed in was directly opposite the London hospital, and so curious medical students and doctors would often stop by to see him. One day, a curious young surgeon came to visit the Elephant Man, and he suggested that his senior colleague, Dr. Frederick Travis, should go and check the exhibit out. So one day, Dr. Travis made an appointment to go and see Joseph before the shop opened. And when he saw him, it said that Dr. Travis was horrified but intrigued, and he asked if he could take the Elephant Man to the hospital for a proper examination. He later wrote about Joseph that his head was the most interesting thing. It was very, very big, like an enormous bag with a lot of books in it. Joseph was displayed by Dr. Travis at a meeting of the Pathological Society of London in 1884. Dr. Travis had several visits with Joseph where he took measurements until Joseph finally grew tired of being poked and prodded, at which time the doctor gave him his calling card and Joseph was sent on his way. By this time, freak shows were starting to be a thing of the past, and the police were starting to close down shops that held such displays because of moral and decency concerns. Now, this was unfortunate for Joseph because he was finally starting to make some money whenever the shop he was working in closed down, and he once again had to scramble to try to find a way to support himself. He joined another traveling circus and continued to go around to other places that had different laws. And he was in Belgium when his new area manager stole all of his money and abandoned him. At this point, Joseph didn't know what to do, and so he made his way back to London, where he almost immediately began to gather crowds, which of course got the attention of the police, who detained him. And the only identifying possession that they had was Dr. Travis's card. So the police called Dr. Travis, who came at once and took Joseph to the hospital, where he made sure that he was washed and fed. After examining Joseph once again, the doctor concluded that this 24-year-old man had a heart condition and likely only had a few years left to live. The chairman of the hospital committee wrote an editorial about Joseph Merrick, and donations flooded in for the Elephant Man's care. The hospital now had the funds they needed to care for him for the rest of his life. In the hospital basement, they adapted 2 adjacent rooms to work for Joseph, and there he had access to a courthouse, and they made sure that there were no mirrors around to remind him of his appearance. Dr. Travis visited him daily, and the two developed a close friendship. Now, he had initially thought that Joseph was mentally handicapped, but once he had spent enough time with him, he was able to understand Joseph's speech impediment and realized that Joseph had completely normal intellect and was fully aware of how the world shrank away from him in disgust. He said that the only woman who did not cower at the sight of him was his mother. So Dr. Travis arranged for Joseph to meet a young, attractive woman. She was briefed on his deformities and then brought in to meet him. It was said to be a very emotional meeting for Joseph, as this was the first time, aside from his mother, that a woman had smiled at him and shook his hand. As time went on, Joseph was also visited by various other wealthy members of London society, including Alexandria, Princess of Wales. The last 4 years of his life that were spent in the hospital's care were said to be when he enjoyed his life more than he ever had. Despite some semblance of an ordinary life in those last few years, Joseph's health continued to decline rapidly, and he was found dead in his bed on April 11th, 1890, at only 27 years old. The autopsy revealed that he had died from asphyxia and suffered a dislocated neck because he had tried to sleep lying down. Joseph, who had every reason to be bitter and angry at the world, instead was said to have held no ill will towards anyone and had an incredibly positive outlook on life despite his circumstances. He was known in the end as a kind and intelligent man who had a very strong Christian faith. He found comfort and hope in his relationship with God and expressed a desire to be accepted based on his soul, not his body. While we often think of these freak shows with absolute disgust, there were some, like Joseph Merrick, whose lives were so difficult that they were grateful for this opportunity to support themselves. While freak shows had been extremely popular and, as we mentioned, quite lucrative for some performers, they were also rife with abuse and neglect, as we've also covered. And by the 1890s, the popularity of these shows had already started to dwindle, as more and more people began to be bothered by the very obvious ethical and moral issues of exploiting people's disabilities and misfortunes. As advancements were made in the world of medicine, this at first piqued people's curiosity even more, as there were now some explanation and diagnosis for these performers' conditions. But very quickly, these explanations began to cause the circus sideshows to lose the element of magic and mystery that they once had. And freak shows began suffering from a major decline in popularity even more as other technology began taking over. The advancements in roller coaster and other amusement park type technologies, as well as the rise of cinema and television, were now capturing people's attention. And by the 1940s, circus freak shows were nearly extinct. Throughout the 20th century, several federal laws made discrimination against people with physical disabilities illegal, and the exhibition of extraordinary bodies was outlawed in some states. More and more of the general public began to see how these shows were exploitative and no longer looked at them with the same curiosity as before. Today, so-called freak shows are seeing a resurgence with thriving shows in Venice Beach, California, and Coney Island in New York City. Though these modern-day performers say that the power is in the hand of the performers. In 1966, the International Independent Showmen's Association was established to provide retirement benefits for performers who are nowadays said to be highly paid, consenting adults.